I'm MJ Reiners, president of Summerland Education, a change management and talent development company. For the past 20 years, I have led large-scale change transformation projects in hospitals and doctors' offices across the country. And what I've learned about change applies to all industries and various aspects of our society. Today, change is happening faster than people can keep up. We see disruption happening all around us and people wanting to live better lives and yet not knowing exactly how to make change stick. I have developed a change management fundamentals class with proven strategies and techniques so you can implement your change successfully. Whether you're working on a business startup, transforming an existing business, or working with social change, these skills are for you. My hope is you'll learn not only to thrive within an era of disruption, but also achieve what you previously thought was impossible. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Change Management Fundamentals class. If you haven't had a chance yet to download the question tracker, please go ahead and do that because I would like for you to record your questions and ideas along the way. And at the end of the class, we'll talk about how you can sign up on my website. And if there's interest, we'll schedule an interactive discussion with our group. I am going to cover 4 main goals for this class. First, I'm going to describe what change management is and why it is important. This will help you gain a better understanding of your role as a change agent so you can develop successful skills. We'll also review some key components of a change effort, including the types of people you're going to work with and the phases that they go through for a change effort. We'll also cover key motivators for our change effort. Lastly, we're going to identify some fundamental strategies for your change plan so that you're off to a super successful start. And lastly, I try to keep my classes as practical as possible. I want to load up your tool belt with as many actual techniques and strategies that have been proven to work. With that being said, I truly encourage you not to take anything I share with you at face value. It's far better for you to take these ideas and techniques and try them out on your own. Find out what works best with your customers and with your projects. That's how you will develop your own lasting skill levels and become more expert. And not every tool and strategy works in every situation. And sometimes it's not just what works well, but sometimes what works like magic, and you want to remember that. My simple definition for change management is helping either yourself or most likely a group of people move from a present state to something new, to a future state or situation. Change management is a process that requires helping people. It's an emotional process. Change management is learning to use a new piece of technology. It's implementing a new rule or a new policy. Change management is winning over people's hearts and their minds. It's adapting to a new environment. It's all of that. And if you, as the change leader, can help them through that process, the results can happen faster with significantly less pain, less suffering, and the outcome that you reach is going to be more effective and more lasting. There is a lot of theory on change management out there, lots of books and research. What I bring to you is my actual experience of having done it. Because a successful change is hard, and if you can learn from my mistakes, you won't have to repeat them. And my hope is that with this education, you'll have less trial and error than I did, and you can be more successful right away. You can start at a higher vantage point, because ultimately, my hope for you is to become an expert change leader, because it's a skill that is so necessary in our world today. In leading large-scale transformations, I have learned what it takes to get new programs or new technology utilized successfully. The new technology part is the easy part. It's the human part that's tough. It's the adoption part that's tough. Because you may have the best new product or service, but if your customers don't use it, you don't continue to sell, right? According to Gartner, a global research company, they estimate that actually 62% of all implementation issues relate to people or to that organization's particular culture. It's not the underlying technology or the underlying workflow that creates challenges. And that's change management in a nutshell. It's about ensuring adoption of your change, adoption of your new product or your new policy, or compliance with a new service. It's about changing hearts and changing minds in order to help them adapt and continue to move forward. And while it sounds like, or it may sound like, that change management is a simple concept, we're going to see it's not so easy to do. I love this quote. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. You see that on the screen there. But to summarize, it must be remembered that there's nothing more difficult to plan than the creation of a new system. And you can take a guess on this, maybe not so obvious, but this is Niccolo Machiavelli from the 1400s. And when I give this talk, I talk about change implementers or change agents or implementers. I use those terms interchangeably. But as an implementer, as a change agent, the work that you do is hard. It's not for the faint of heart. It is not for those who tire easily. And it's also not for those who resort to Machiavellian tactics. Using pressure tactics or force doesn't result in permanent change. Because in order for change to stick, we have to take a different approach. Successful change requires awareness of human behavior and empathy. It also requires compassion. So as a change leader, if you can learn to enjoy this process, that's what's going to keep you moving. Change is fun. It's never boring and it's never the same project twice. And if you can keep it fun and enjoy it, you're going to learn so much about the process, and that's what's going to help you to continue to power through. After working on hundreds of change projects over the years, my personal philosophy on change management is to always make it better. This is a cornerstone to remember. All too often when people get really excited about change, it's because something is not working and causing a lot of pain. And so there's this groundswell enthusiasm that builds, and there's a strong desire to start over or to completely get rid of the old. And to tear down the old or destroy something of the past, that's not the hard part. The hard part is the build. Building something new that's going to be lasting takes a long time. And it really doesn't take a lot of strategy or talent to break down the old. Where you need skill is in that building of the new. And if your customer or your audience gets a sense that you're going to start from scratch or throw it all out, throw the baby out with the bathwater, change becomes a lot harder because your resistance is going to increase. And you're already working in a difficult position. A better approach is to first think through, what do you want to keep? What's the best of the past or your present situation? And what's worth improving? What do you want to make sure that you want to keep? And what do you want to focus on preserving for the future? This will often require you to partner with your customer or your audience. You'll begin to advocate for them. To preserve and improve, we must learn to understand the change process and become active participants in it. To successfully lead change efforts, we have to understand people's needs and their problems. So an effective change management strategy is one that takes into consideration those human needs and then create and show them a path. I personally believe every change implementation can be successful. Will you make mistakes? Yes, you will. Will they be permanent? Not unless you give up. So a key take here is to document those lessons learned so that as you go, you're able to share the lessons with your team and to adapt for future projects. That way, your project can be better than the last one, and you continue to master new skills and gain an expertise. And besides, change is not going away very soon, so challenge yourself to become that change expert. So here's a slide to help you remember that. Preserve the best and improve the rest. Okay, we're now going to go into the 5 key adopter groups. Every organization is unique in how people react to change, and every person is unique in how they go through it. Organization cultures are built over time, and values and principles slowly mold people's actions and behaviors. So when we have something new that enters into that culture, it can be quite slow and quite disruptive for people to adapt to a new way. And often living in the in-between world where the new way isn't quite there, but the old way is gone, is very, very difficult for people. And it's a big part why people resist change and often cling to the past. There are different groups of people and how they move through change. This book, Diffusion of Innovation by Everett Rogers, highlighted a key study done in the 1940s by two sociologists, Bryce Ryan and Neil Gross. And they published a study on the use of hybrid seed among Iowa farmers. And the study focused on how quickly that new seed was adopted by the farmers. This hybrid seed was better than the traditional one, and it was stronger against drought. It was more resistant against disease and bugs. And this now famous study resulted in a tremendous amount of research among these 5 adapter groups. Ryan and Gross classified these segments of Iowa farmers in relation to the time that it took for them to adopt the innovation. Here, the hybrid corn seed. And they called these 5 elements or adapter categories the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. And I will tell you that nobody likes being called a laggard, so I call them the late adopters. And these groups fall in a normal bell curve, like you might see with a lot of things. Innovators are around 2.5%, maybe 3%. Your early adopter groups are about 14%. Both your early majority and your late majority make up 34% each. So that's your bulk of your people. That's about 70% are your early and your late majority. And then your late adopters or your laggards are about 16%. In implementing electronic medical records in hospitals and clinics across the country, I've had the opportunity to work with every single one of these adapter groups, while the industry of healthcare moved slowly towards using computers to provide and document patient care. And as a result, I've learned that each of these groups have unique needs and different communication methods. And I'm going to share with you what I've learned about these adapter groups. Innovators, like you might expect, are very adventurous types, and they put a big value on going first. They want to be seen as innovators, and they like being on the cutting edge. Innovation is very exciting to them, and they're eager to try new things. Innovators are also good at imagining the possibilities, and they're willing to give things a try. One of my very first projects implementing an electronic medical record in an emergency room included a very good friend of mine who was a nurse and a software developer, and a whiteboard. We had no documents, no manuals, we had nothing else to rely on along with our customer that included about 20 super passionate, loud nurses and ED staff who worked with us for about 8 to 10 hours a day, screaming and yelling over us, over each other. And at the end of the day, the software developer would go home and he would code what he had heard from our conversations and what we had documented on that whiteboard and come back the next day and show the results. And we'd start all over again. Lots of screaming, lots of yelling. There was so much passion. It was chaotic and crazy, but it was so much fun. And that one project has resulted in a lot of memories and really lasting relationships. And that's a really great example of the innovator group, because they have this really deep pioneer spirit and they like to work with each other and they've got each other's backs. They know it's hard work, but they also know that they're paving the way for those who are going to come after them. And while innovators don't necessarily like or relish risk, they're not afraid of it. And oftentimes their passion or their pioneer spirit is higher than that fear of that risk. Another key about innovators is they have a lot less patience than other groups, and speed is super important to them. They want to be first. They want to gain those benefits of being recognized as a market leader. Now, as a change leader, your early adopters are a really, really important adopter group. This group is very open-minded and willing to take risk, but they're much more judicious about it. You have to show them the results from that innovator group. And at the same time, they won't only take their word for it. They want to know about those experiences of the innovators, but they also want data to confirm that decision whether to adopt and move forward or not. People in this category will postpone a decision if that early evidence, that early data isn't available. And this is particularly seen in fields of science. So early adopters are very careful and they make well-informed decisions. They don't automatically trust the experience of the innovators, and they can sometimes see that group as being too eager or too risky. Instead, they focus on research themselves, and as a result, because they're so judicious and careful, they tend to gain a lot of respect from the groups that follow them. So early adopters are often seen as champions of change or as opinion leaders, because most people in society do not do a tremendous amount of detailed research in making a decision whether to adopt an innovation. Instead, they put their trust and faith in opinion leaders or champions who have gone ahead of them. Secondly, most people in society don't want to have this feeling of being left behind. They want to stay current with the group. So they'll listen and follow advice of their champions. So early adopters and opinion leaders will help you get to this magical tipping point that Gross and Ryan discussed. And we're going to talk about that in a slide. But once you've reached that tipping point, you will feel it. Momentum starts to carry you forward, and the remainder of your work is faster, but you still have a lot of it to go. The early and late majority. So Ryan and Gross studies showed that these groups make up about 70% and will follow the adoption based on their trusted opinion leaders. So storytelling is really important here. People will be motivated by the success stories of those who have gone ahead of them. They don't demand as much proof or as much data or do as much detailed research. And when working with the innovators and early adopters, it's really important to make sure that you're recording those stories so that you can use them with the early and the late majority. Compelling and motivating stories will help get the early and late majority groups to move. In my experience with working with these groups, they're more detailed. They're very focused on operational details, and they want to make things work for the long term. So this group is most likely to build solid operational processes and focus on how do you maintain that change. They'll get deeper into those operational details compared to an early adopter group or an innovator may say, oh, we didn't even think about that. We were too busy focused on just getting this done. In my experience, I have found that the early majority are now very focused on risk and they want to minimize it. So they want best practices and they want lots of information on other people's experiences. They're not as concerned about speed because they can't be first, but they are focused on being the best. So they put a lot of time and energy into managing and minimizing risk, as well as maximizing the quality of the experience of adoption, of the change experience, as well as outcomes. Another interesting observation from my experience in working with the late majority. While they can take a long time to make a decision, when they do, they have this sudden awareness that they're late and they're quite behind. And it's either they adopt now the new innovation or they might get left behind. So they become very interested in seizing opportunities that allow them to leapfrog over the groups who've gone ahead of them. So they like best practices a lot and they want to use those as a starting point, but they also start to focus right away on optimizing, on doing things that others haven't done in order to make that change better and more improved. So they have a lot of urgency as a result to get to the front of the line. And speed is very important to them because there is the desire to catch up or come from behind and therefore reestablish their position in the marketplace. Now let's talk a little bit about late adopters. Late adopters can be either very traditional groups or they may have a financial reason to protect the status quo. As a result, it can take a lot more time for late adopters to adopt innovation. And if they're traditional, they often interact with others who have very traditional values. And from what my experience, a very workable strategy here is to use peer-to-peer communication. It is important to note that many innovations, however, don't reach a full 100% of adoption for many reasons, and spending time and energy here can be really, really expensive. So most change efforts put a larger part of time and energy on those first set of groups. And before we leave this topic, what about resistance? You will have resistance or a resistor group in any of these 5 adopter groups, although not really so much with innovators. And resistance is normal with change. And it's something super interesting that I learned in working with resistors is they're often really, really passionate people, and they're passionate for a reason. So it's up to you as the change leader to figure out what that reason is. And if you can flip that on its head, you can really win over a very, very powerful ally. If they have a sense, if your resistors have a sense that you're going to start from scratch or to, again, throw that baby out with the bathwater, that might be the reason that they're resisting. It's because they've been using something that they know is good. And so it's up to you and your team to figure out what is the best that should be preserved and then go about improving the rest. And if you can convert some of your resistors to your team, you have great allies because they're super passionate people and they will drive forward your change with you. So what is this mythical S-curve and tipping point? It comes from the Ryan and Gross study that showed the diffusion of the hybrid seed innovation followed a S-shaped curve over time. It takes a long time to get a population to that 10 to 25% to adopt an innovation. That's what they called the tipping point. But after the tipping point, like a domino effect kicks in, and from there, it's a much faster period of adoption. So for 70 to 90% of your people, the decision is based heavily on the experiences of those first 10 to 25%. And then those that decide not to adopt risk losing status or even potentially business viability. So as a change leader, what does this mean for you? So that domino effect is critically important to your work in ensuring long-term adoption efforts. The earliest experiences of your product, your service, or that policy are critical for adoption and common use. So this is where you want to put the most time and energy in crafting experiences to ensure successful customer use. So choose your change partners really carefully. You want to identify innovators and early adopters who are highly respected by their peer group. You want to find opinion leaders. You want to find those leaders who can speak the language of their peers. For instance, in healthcare, we often use nurses to help work with nurses, and we use physicians to help train other physicians. A second key strategy is to consider the size of your project compared to the size of your organization. Now, your very first project, or if you're doing a pilot project, it may not have enough people to get you to that 20 or 25%. So you might have to have 2 projects or 3, sequentially to get you to that magical tipping point. So consider this in planning for your change efforts. And my recommendation is to plan for that tipping point to be closer to that 20 to 25%. And if it happens earlier, all the better. The hardest part about managing the tipping point is timing. It's frustrating for that wait to kick in momentum, and it can be frustrating. And that early creation of those project experiences, customer experience, those are really, really important. So let's talk about now the 5 phases of change that people go through. As a change agent, uncertainty is your enemy. People will tell you that they hate change, but what it really means is they hate uncertainty. They hate the unknown. We all do. It's just part of human nature. It's our core psychology as human beings. So as a change agent, the more certainty you can provide at each step along the way, the more you can help people see your change, feel it, or experience it, the more successful you are going to be. By helping people to see it and experience it, put it down on paper, let them see it in black and white. That is how you win the battle of adoption, is step by step, taking it in increments. Now there's general categories of change phases that people go through. The first one is awareness. This is just basic knowledge about your change and how it functions. This can be the who, the what, the where, possibly the when. And then the second phase is understanding. This is where a customer begins to form an opinion, either favorable or unfavorable. And this is where you want to explain the why. The why for the change is super, super important here. Why should they adapt or change? This is where that applies to the stage of understanding. The third phase is acceptance. A person will engage in activities that either lead to a choice to adopt or to reject the innovation. They start to make a decision. They start to decide. And then the fourth phase is adoption itself. That's where the customer or your stakeholders actually start to use your change or to start working with your current policy or trying the new service. They start to experience it. And then the last phase is compliance, or even beyond that, improvement. The person will evaluate the results of the change. Did they like it? Did they live up to the expectations or the promises that were made? Did the change work or not? Did they like it or not? And if they like it, they're more likely to start thinking about how can they work with it and make it better. So it's important to remember during the phases of implementation that different parts of your organization are going to be at these phases. You as your change leader and often your team members, you're going to be the end. You're already at compliance, possibly thinking about improving things. But you'll have to communicate and help build awareness with the majority of your organization. And if you're like me, the biggest challenge that you'll have is what did it feel like at the beginning? And it's hard to remember what it's like at awareness. You somewhat forget what your questions were, what your first impressions were, what concerns did you have. So if you can, remember those states and write them down and help build stories around those so that you can share your thoughts and feelings with your customers who are in those early phases and help build from from awareness to understanding and then to acceptance. So the key takeaway here is to communicate to your audience based on the stage that they are at, not the stage where you are. And with all of your communication strategies, they need to include both methods and messages that reach people in all of these phases as they go through the change. And if you have people in your organization who've already adopted the change, those are some great communicators for you. They're your best allies to help build education and train new people. And so you'll see next in terms of what motivates people, trying things out and observing others are fundamental strategies of motivation. Now we're going to move into that. Here are the 5 common reasons why people adopt innovation or change. Fundamentally, a person's going to make a decision based on a gain or a loss. That's an important thing to remember. It's really fundamental. If they believe that this new thing or new idea is better than the old one, they'll try it. This is what Everett Rogers referred to as relative advantage. Compatibility is the next motivator. This is how much the innovation is perceived to be compatible with existing values or possibly solving problems based on their needs. For example, people in technology pride themselves on having or trying out the newest technologies, newest gadgets. So they're likely to be the first ones to go buy those new iPhones or try out an electric car. Doctors are more likely to prescribe early detection procedures because they believe that early detection procedures are good for their patients. So new procedures are in compatibility with their values. To increase the probability of adoption, the innovation must address an issue that's perceived to be a problem. And most often, the bigger the pain, the easier it is for adoption. So this is another key component of compatibility, is solving problems or addressing a particular need. I think often about heart surgeons and how they are able to convince patients to have open heart surgery. That is at that point a decision of life and death. So the pain is at a very, very high point there. But where there are innovations or change where an audience doesn't see a problem, the change is a lot harder and innovation is a lot slower. Not that it can't happen, but there's going to have to be a lot more innovation or education around your innovation in order to get people to adopt. A third key motivator for change is complexity. Changes or innovations that are easier to use have a higher rate of adoption and a higher speed to adoption. And this plays a big role in our change strategies. So simple changes are easier to adopt than more complex ones. However, for complex changes, the change leader has to do more work and simplify the solution. Can you break it down into manageable chunks for the customer? Can you break it down so they start to experience it in different components? For example, changing from one medication to a second medication is a relatively simple and easy adoption for most people. However, in contrast, preventative measures around diet and exercise are not as quickly adopted, or stopping smoking, in spite of the potential health gains, because those are more challenging and complex types of habits to break. Trialability is another key motivator, and that's the ability to try it out, to try before a person buys. So when people have a chance to do that, they're more likely to adopt it. And with software projects, we would always encourage our customers to be involved with end user testing or come to training so they had a chance to practice on the new software before they actually had to start using it. And then lastly, a key motivator is observability, the ability to watch somebody else try it out, or simply the knowledge that someone else is already using it. For example, in surgery, there is a common premise of utilizing the latest and greatest surgical techniques is best for patients. And so if one surgeon is already using a new piece of cutting edge technology, adoption amongst the other surgeons are a lot higher, because there is a disadvantage of being left behind by not adopting that new technology. So fellow surgeons are often likely to follow suit of the opinion leader or early adopters within their own surgical unit. So key takeaways for building your change strategies is the biggest obstacle for you here is uncertainty. If you can get your customer to physically experience your change early, often, whether that's your new product or new service, that's going to lead them to adoption. And secondly, when you are using your communication strategies, remember to meet people where they are, not where you are. And current research suggests that the most effective communication vehicle is face-to-face interaction. And the best motivating technique is also personal testimony. So if you can use opinion leaders that already have established relationships with their peer group, they are some key wins for you to work with. Okay, so we've now kind of covered the change fundamentals. We talked about the 5 adopter groups, the types of people you're going to be working with. We discussed the phases of change, the stages that people go through in accepting a change. We also talked about what motivates people to make a change. Now we're going to talk about your role as a change leader. As a change leader, you have a really big job. A lot of change efforts are organic or evolve out of a crisis. and therefore they mainly consist of trial and error types of efforts. And yet I see commonly that change efforts die out before the outcome can be achieved because of a lack of planning. So the more thought and detail you can put into a strategic change plan, the more likelihood of your success. So taking time at the beginning will help pay off in the long run. And your role as the change leader is to develop 5 elements for your change effort. A very basic yet powerful change plan will include 5 components: vision, incentives, momentum, communication, and support. Now, I often get questions by executives in terms of what's more important, a top-down change management strategy or a bottom-up change management strategy. In reality, what I answer is it's both. You must have vision and your executive leadership supporting your vision and providing resources from a top-down strategy. And then you need grassroots effort and widespread adoption in order for your change to stick. So both are required, and this plan includes both of those in your change strategy, includes both your vision and incentive for a grassroots support. So there are 3 tasks that a change leader develops in the visioning part of a strategic plan. The vision statement itself, which is sometimes called the pitch speech. You'll also establish a governance plan, which at its most basic is how decisions are going to be made and who's going to make those decisions. You'll develop a risk mitigation and resistance plan. When you have all of these put together, you're going to have an element of a change charter, which is a document that very, very few projects actually utilize, and it's a great tool to ensure your success. So let's walk through each of these individually. For me, one of the most difficult things, or not so much difficult, but what's most important things to get your arms around is the vision piece. We often see that projects get started and the organization doesn't have a full grasp of what is their vision, what are they trying to accomplish, and what are the results that they want. In order to develop your vision statement, I encourage change leaders to answer 4 questions. The first is your purpose statement, and that is answering the question, why are we doing this? Purpose statements that solve pain are most effective. So take note of that. Secondly, what will the future look like? The more descriptive, the more visual you can provide for people, the better. Can you provide diagrams or even photos? Blueprints for new buildings are super effective to develop a sense of inspiration and excitement among team members. What about creative artwork or other types of visual pictures that you can use? And while purpose statements are often verbal or lots of words, pictures again, or words 1,000 words. So people are more compelled and committed when they can actually see it. Because the more physical we can make the change, the more certainty we provide. How will we get there? This is a big question you'll be asked as a change leader. And in the beginning, you're not going to have all the answers. You're not going to have all of the details. And that's okay. You do want to kind of think through 2 things at the beginning. And that is, what is the scope of your change in terms of what's included in the change and what's not, so that you can be really clear in establishing expectations around that. And secondly, who's going to go first? Understanding which part of your organization or what pilot projects might be going first is important. And then you can figure out your sequencing later. So you want to think about, how do you get your team, your organization to that tipping point? That's what you want to think through. And as the change leader, you're not going to have all of the details figured out, but if you have those 2 main components of the how, that's enough to get you started. And you'll leverage your project managers who are excellent at this stuff. They will help develop all of the milestones along the way, the key deliverables, and help you with the methodology that you'll use to manage those tasks and deliverables. And then together, when you have all of this, you can decide on establishing a kickoff date to discuss with your wider audience those details, or even establish some project updates as you continue to move forward. Another key question people are going to ask is, what's in it for me? And even if they're not verbalizing this, they are thinking it. So as a change leader, you need to think through this as your change strategy and address what the benefits are to your stakeholders. Understanding their needs and problems of your audience and then linking the change effort back to those needs and problems is the way that you're going to get those benefits. Another key strategy here is to make sure you talk about how it'll feel. How's that change going to feel? The more sensory language you can use here, the better. Successful change executives talk about what success feels like in order to promote breakthrough thinking. They talk about how good it feels to win or how good it feels to be first. And this is a really powerful strategy to help people and inspire and to motivate them. So now you've got your 4 elements of your change strategy: the purpose, the picture, the plan, and the personal gain. Those are the elements of your pitch speech. And sometimes people call it elevator speech, where a short and compelling argument that answers those questions, and you can start to win over hearts and minds to your change effort. All right, moving on then, the second main task a change leader develops in the planning phase of vision is developing a governance structure. So what is project or change governance? This is an area that many organizations struggle with in their change efforts, and I've seen really, really complex governance structures. One project I had was $350 million with over 200 team members, so we had dozens of committees, but you don't need that. You want to keep it as simple as possible within the organization structure, committee structure that you already have, if possible. So for now, let's start with just these 4. As the change leader, you're going to determine or work with other leaders to determine the governance structure, the decision-making process and principles, the change champions that you're going to work with, and then how are you going to staff your team. In considering governance structure, this is the who and what types of decisions are going to be made. And so in establishing this, you want to think about 2 things. You want to think about strategic decisions related to the scope, the timing, the budget, and the timeline of your project. And this is often your owner or your executives will need to ensure that you have the resources to fund the change that's provided, and so your project is properly funded. As I mentioned, projects that aren't properly funded don't go very far. And then secondly, you'll want to think through who will be making your day-to-day operational decisions. And this will be around the day-to-day use of the change, the new technology, the new service, who's going to be required to utilize the new policy, those types of things. So you want to think of those operational staff members who are using the change themselves. So those are the types of change. And then you're going to look at the who, and who has the 4 responsibilities to make decisions. You're going to want to determine who recommends decisions, whether those are operational or strategic, so those can be 2 different groups. Who has the authority to approve decisions, who can veto or decline decisions, and then who can break ties. This is one that's really important to do up front because you don't want to get into a conflict situation and not have the determining person or group who can break a tie. And if you can develop it up front, it'll save you lots of headaches. Okay, the next one on this slide is about decision making. So establishing decision-making principles that align with your vision and outcomes desired are greatly helpful to set clear expectations with your organization and keep the project moving on a timely basis. A common one that I see and encourage is don't let perfection be the enemy of good. This will help your teams from overanalyzing certain decisions and processes and keep them out of that analysis paralysis spiral, and helping them to make decisions on a timely basis. Another one is to listen to experts and gather data, but to own the decision ourselves. And this helps to enhance accountability and responsibility from within the team. Another technique that I have used is setting time limits for how long a decision can be evaluated. You can make it 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever is appropriate for your organization. But if that team doesn't develop a decision within those time limits, it's automatically moved up in the governance structure. And this rule alone resulted in really high compliance because committees want to make their own decisions that they're accountable for. And they want to do that in a robust and responsible way. Next, you'll think about your change champions. Who's going to be the face of your change? The leaders on the front lines, the people who are going to deeply partner with your stakeholders and possibly be working with some of your resistors to help understand and provide proper communications with them. So a lot of responsibility of your change champions, again, possibly those are your opinion leaders, is going to be communicating and educating people on the front lines. Then you're also going to look at staffing the team. Who is actually going to do the work? And this is a group of people you want to evaluate for who knows the organization the best and who has peer-to-peer leadership within your organization. Who are those people on the front lines that other people respect and look to for leadership and guidance within your actual departments? Another key attribute here is diversity, both culturally, socially, as well as organizationally. You want to make sure you're not leaving a key stakeholder group behind. And thinking of that, don't forget your customers. Should a customer representative be on your change team? Do they want to be part of the design, and should they help you with that so that you're evaluating a product that's going to be best for them? A key takeaway here, rule of thumb, is to keep that team as small as you can and empower them to make as many of the tactical and operational decisions as possible. A third part of what change leaders do in the visioning exercise is an exercise in assessing risk. One way to go about doing that is to conduct a readiness assessment. What is your organization's prior experience with change? What worked well and what did not? What are the things or aspects of your current state that you want to preserve, and what do you want to improve? Again, going back to our mantra we talked about earlier. Another technique for assessing risk is something I learned a long time ago that's really effective, called the newspaper headline, or today it might be called the social media viral story. The exercise is to identify potential risks to a project by asking different work groups to imagine the worst possible headline they can think of that would be as a result of the change, and then working together to put a preventative strategy or a risk mitigation strategy in place before you endeavor on the change effort process. And if you start with some of the bigger risks and come up with preventative strategies, you'll find that some of those strategies apply to lots of things. And then you'll actually avoid a lot of projects or a lot of potential problems within your project and help avoid crises altogether. But just the thinking process alone helps you to do better planning and avoid problems. Resistance is a huge topic, and I literally could talk days about this. But two takeaways for you today is, number one, listen to your resistors. Respect them. They often have a reason why they're resisting, and if you can figure that out, they're likely to give you some really, really valuable information. Now, sometimes it doesn't come across in a not so nice way, but if you can hear them out and you can build trust and credibility for the long haul. And one thing you want to avoid is ignoring resistance, because that is a surefire way for resistance to increase. And even though resistance is really uncomfortable, as a change leader, if you can make sure that you or one of your opinion leaders or your change champions is out there listening to people, it'll go a long way to make sure that your change is effective. A second key strategy or concept around resistance is to remember applying reason, even forcefully, does not work in emotional situations. And change by itself is an emotional process. Emotions run high in our change projects. There's emotions of loss, emotions of inaccuracy or embarrassment. There's even grief. And logic or rational approaches will not fix emotional problems. If you try to logic your way out of it, most likely your change or stakeholders are going to check out. Instead, if you focus on the emotional level first through active listening and letting your stakeholders' voices be heard, if you seek to understand their problems, and if you can adapt your plan to show adjustment for those common concerns, you're going to be way far ahead in assuring success. Now, you can't solve all emotional issues. That's really important to acknowledge. But create space to allow people to express their emotions and show you're willing to adapt and lead by example, your project will get you where you want to go, and you'll be able to gain credibility and maintain morale. So we've now covered the initial planning efforts that a change leader goes through in the vision stage. And to wrap those up, those are to establish a vision statement. That's your pitch statement or your pitch speech, or elevator strategy. You're going to talk about or define your governance structure and guidelines for making decisions. You want to identify your change champions and staff the project. And you also want to proactively think through some risk mitigation strategies and also some resistance strategies. And then if you take all these elements and you document them into a project charter, you will be so much further ahead than most change efforts. A project charter really sets you up for success because it helps set expectations with your organization and has provided you solid groundwork. So the next slide that we're going to talk about with our change plan relates to incentives. So you've got that vision and that top-down, that executive involvement piece. Now we're going to talk about your grassroots support. We talked about for a change leader to have your change stick, you want to get to that tipping point as soon as possible. So who you partner with here to build a grassroots support is really, really critical. A change effort is about developing a coalition. It's about developing a movement for your change. And so gaining that grassroots support and buy-in is a must. Many people will think that incentives mean automatically monetary incentives. And not necessarily they have to take that off the table, but if that's the only tool that you have, then a lot of times people just go back to the old way once those monetary incentives are no longer present. A more permanent incentive to developing grassroots support is through active involvement. You want to empower your stakeholders, any group that's going to be impacted by the change, to get involved and make as many operational decisions as possible. And there's a couple strategies you can use to do that. One, look for your innovators and your early adopters in your organization, the enthusiastic, creative types, and give them the microphone. Let them go out and talk to people. Put them on the front lines of your communication effort. Another big incentive for people is to give them the chance to be involved in the design or the build of your change. Look for the people who are natural problem solvers, people who like to collaborate. Those are excellent people to have involved. And while you can't include everyone in your change effort, in your work effort, look for those opinion leaders within key departments so that your staff are well respected and involved and can help build that coalition and that grassroots. Giving people a chance to showcase their talents and work with their strengths is also a really, really inspiring way to build grassroots. They know it's going to be hard work, but it's work that's meaningful to them and that they like to do. And so many times you'll be surprised they're more than willing to participate. Complex change requires diverse teams. And the more complex the change, the more diversity from your stakeholders you want to have, culturally, socially, and organizationally. You want lots of faces and voices in order to build on buy-in and build grassroots support. And it's key, don't leave any stakeholder group behind in your change efforts. And remember also that involvement strategies will vary based on your adopter groups and the phases of change that they are in. It's really difficult for people to let go of the past if they can't understand why the change is happening, if they don't really know if that change meets a need or improves a problem that they already have, if they have no idea how the change is going to affect them, and if there's not a reliable plan to implement the change. So your customer involvement strategies want to address these types of questions. And often the best people to answer those questions to win over somebody in a department are the people that they already trust. So find those people that they will listen to. In work in healthcare, we use and work with doctors to train other doctors because they find that experience being trained by a physician is more effective. And so the key takeaway or reminder here is that peer-to-peer communication is what's going to help you build your grassroots support. I like this cartoon here. You may have already seen it. It's a common one. It's a popular one. I'll let you take a few seconds to walk through that. So the moral of this cartoon is that customers cannot always articulate their needs. And so a mantra that I share with my team members all the time is don't give them what they ask for, give them what they need. A good change agent, a good implementer, they will figure that out. You got to dig deeper. Your job is to give them what they need and to solve problems and solve opportunities for them. That way you'll gain a much longer support of your change and you'll make your stakeholders happy. There are a few key ways of making sure that your design change is correct as you move forward. Get the right people in the room to validate and test your design early and often. Get stakeholders to see prototypes or mock-ups of your change. And then finally, are there ways that you can immerse your stakeholders in the change before they have to actually live with that change? We use dress rehearsals in healthcare software all the time, and it's a really good way for people to experience and practice and build new behaviors with their team members before they actually have to start using the software on a day-to-day basis. So in summarizing, it's really worth the upfront cost that you'll spend to avoid long-term headache of giving them what they asked for but not what they needed. So now that we've gone through the fundamental components of a change plan established, the vision and the incentives, the third requirement for any change plan is momentum. Momentum is your best friend. Both team progress and speed are two components that a change leader has to manage. Effective collaboration will set your speed. Having the right people, a successful mindset, who are properly focused and committed will allow you to go much faster. And as your grassroots support expands, momentum will build as well. Change teams that make steady progress have higher morale and are more likely to meet their goals than sluggish projects who tend to miss deadlines all the time and start to erode trust. So people want to be on winning teams and they're willing to put in the effort to make sure of that. So make sure that your team keeps the momentum up. How fast your organization can adopt change is going to be impacted by a lot of things. And you as the change leader, if you can remove as many of these obstacles at the front or early, the faster you will be able to go. A key one that is frequently seen and very, very common, and just reality in many regards, is competing priorities. Those are going to slow you down, and they do put some risk to your project. So it's important to kind of see if you can minimize those. There's an old phrase that applies here: if you chase two rabbits, you're going to catch neither. Meaning that if your team members specifically, if their focus and commitment is split, they're not as likely to achieve the results that you want, at least on a timeline basis. So change efforts that have high amounts of dedication and focus are more likely to reach their results and to do it on time and on budget. So consider that in establishing your teams. And with big transformation projects, there needs to be dedicated focus and participation. Old habits and bad memories of previous project failures can be a real disadvantage to you and to your team. So learn your culture inside and out and find out what worked well in the past and what did not. Don't repeat the mistakes or the failures of previous projects. To create a better experience for people, you will be able to gain their trust. So break their expectations of a bad experience. Was training bad before with the previous project? Then have a great training team, great training program. Was communication secretive or included big surprises that people weren't expecting? Then make sure that you have an open and transparent communication process. Another huge win is to be organized. One of the key things that I did for a really large software validation session where we had over 500 attendees participate, my team, we developed individual personalized itineraries that helped each person know exactly which session that they should attend. So we had dozens of these, but they only attended a certain number of them throughout their day. And just that one key deliverable, that personalized itinerary, was so valued and really went a long, long way to gaining credibility for our project and establishing rapport with our stakeholders. So that was a key win. So ideas like that, to be organized, really will help show that your team is dedicated and they know what they're doing and they can manage the change effort for the larger audience. I love this slide because it reminds me of one of my favorite strategies for change, and that is to build a bullet train for your project. And so what is it about bullet trains that you want to remember? Well, one, they run fast. And two, they run on schedule. Well, at least in Europe, they do. So a key takeaway is that your project schedule is your bullet train. So meet your milestones along the way. Don't get behind. Protect your bullet train as much as possible and maintain those deliverables throughout your project. All right, the next key element is communications. And there's many aspects of the communication plan that are applicable to change management efforts. And my very first recommendation is work with your communication experts and your marketing experts that are already within your organization, because you're going to need strategic communication efforts for a large change project or a complex change project. So there are 4 key elements that you want to consider for your communication plan. Marketing. A really good friend of mine says that implementation is marketing. So consider your change effort as a really, really big PR project. And so that's why you want to have those communication experts or those marketing experts working with you. And again, don't forget your customer as a key audience member. Developing a mantra or a slogan. Earlier we talked about the purpose of a vision and your purpose statement for a change. And if you could come up with a really meaningful mantra, this could go a long way to galvanize understanding of that vision and purpose. It can also galvanize support around your change. One team I worked with came up with a mantra. They used best install ever. And this worked like magic in terms of gaining momentum and building support and really setting a high bar that the team wanted to make sure that they achieved. In your communication efforts, make sure that you identify all of your audience members. Don't leave any particular stakeholder group out. And remember that you want to communicate in the phase that that stakeholder group or individual is in, not from the state where you are. A lot of change efforts also make a lot of promises, and that's an almost surefire way for failure. Be clear, be really clear about what your change is going to do and what it's not going to do. And make sure that you're developing realistic expectations around your change, because if you don't manage those expectations, people are going to make up expectations themselves. And I always say, if you don't control the rumor mill will control you. So ensure that you've got your entire organization moving forward in the same direction, and make sure that your key leaders, your executives, your sponsors, your champions, that they're all on message. They're all saying the same thing. That pitch speech or that elevator story that you developed earlier in the vision section. The consistency of message builds confidence in your audience, and it also increases buy-in. One change management study showed that employees want to hear about the change effort from both their CEO and their frontline supervisor. So as a change leader, make sure those two people are saying the same thing. You want to communicate the basics frequently and on repeat. The who, what, where, when, and how of the change. Those are really critical for people. And you'll find that there's really no possible way to over communicate with people. You want to communicate before, during, and after your change. And a lot of times those initial efforts are not going to stick. They're not going to remember. So you have to find different vehicles to maintain or try to get people's attention. Use flyers, use presentations in the hallways, use personalized emails, or even an old school method like a personalized letter can really do a lot to gain somebody's attention. I use the old communications adage of communicate 7 different times, 7 different ways. And that's at a minimum if you have a complex project. A recent project that I worked on, that we put flyers up in elevators so that people, while they're in a state of attention for 30 to 60 seconds, they can see that flyer and read about the change effort. Lastly, always provide a forum for input, for feedback back to you and to your team. Remember that communication is both input and output. And you and your team will have a lot to educate on and a lot to talk about, but you also want to set up listening sessions with your stakeholders to address their questions and their concerns. If you can set up focus groups or Q&A sessions or even staff meetings, let your stakeholders communicate back to you so that you can adjust accordingly. So here's a graphic representation that I use quite frequently in my communication plans to show you how to communicate 7 different ways, 7 different times. So you identify your stakeholder groups, your key customer groups, and you may have more or less than these. And you also want to communicate or identify your communication vehicles. What opportunities do you have to communicate with people? An intranet, demonstrations, those types of things. For extremely busy people, which people in business are, they don't always catch their attention until the change becomes effective or soon. So expect that and be willing to work through and provide with fresh content as your project moves forward. Lastly, make sure to develop a regular schedule. Use department meetings, employee staff meetings. Again, don't forget your customers. How are you going to communicate with them? Maybe on your website. And get your customer on your side early for the change, and your change effort becomes a lot easier. And you want to maintain an open and transparent communication culture. Okay, so now we're heading into the final section of your change plan, and this one is really critical. This is the part that most often gets dropped, but it's also the most important step to ensure long-term adoption. Support is required so that your stakeholders won't go back to the old way. It's just normal. It's just human nature. And while I expect you'll do a really wonderful job with all the other components, vision, buy-in, momentum, and your communication plan, if you and your team do not actively support your customers after a change is implemented, they'll likely go back to their old methods. Again, to a great extent, it's just human nature. So this requires some advanced thinking and planning, and if you can, dedicating a portion of your team who will specialize in supporting your customers until they can actively support themselves. An important concept to balance here is how much or how little do you support. Helping people too much, for example, if you're always doing the new change for them, they won't develop the long-lasting skills that they need. And secondly, if you don't help them enough during a change effort, especially at the very beginning of when your change is active, then they're likely to get frustrated and quit. This is an important lever to remember, and striking the right balance requires some compassion and education. I always think of kids learning how to ride a bike. They need the training wheels first. And most of the time, they're the ones who decide to take those training wheels off. And I think you'll find mostly that happens with your customers as well. Change is hard on people, and compassion is required. So as a change leader, lead by example and demonstrate good change skills. Active listening, flexibility, and perseverance. In many cases, you are rocking your customer's world, so being empathetic and understanding their position and their values will go a long way. Project confidence and have faith in them that they'll get through it, and they will. A couple quick tips here. Help your customers to set realistic expectations. Go ahead and define normal for them and give them small goals to move through each day. Listen to them and help them course correct. In the beginning, it's always better to show them a couple times how it works, merely than just telling them. But after they've had a chance to see it a couple times, they need to physically do the procedure. They need to physically practice that new method in order for them to gain long-term skills, so they'll develop and take action themselves. Remember that change management is about people and their emotions. It's about showing that you care about them. So what you may think are small things may not be small things to your customers. They're letting go of some feelings and some rituals that they used to rely on every day. So try to remember where you first started. Tell them how you got through it. If you can think about when you were at that point of awareness with a new change, and share your experiences with them. People love stories, so go ahead and tell yours. Plant the seeds of change early and often. Help them to know what's normal, help them to know how to prepare. And explaining what is normal for them, they should be able to work through this particular phase of the project. And in doing this, you're helping to reduce uncertainty. And lastly, a really key tip is to help anticipate their needs. What are the most common challenges you as a leader have experienced that your customers go through? Can you provide them with tip sheets or quick tip reminders to help support themselves when you are not physically present? So we've now summarized the 5 main components of a really awesome change management plan. And I know that if you cover these basics, it will work for you. So let's talk about some of those takeaways, some final strategies to bring all of this together. Remember to leverage innovators and opinion leaders to get you past the tipping point. Remember, those early experiences are really critical in order for you to gain critical mass and long-term adoption. Another key takeaway, utilize the 5 adopter groups, the 5 phases, the 5 motivators, in each of those 5 components for your strategic change plan. And a big reminder, for change to stick, you need both that top-down and bottom-up effort. You need both the leadership vision and resources, as well as a grassroots support for buy-in, because it's both that power and permanence that will make change stick. Reduce uncertainty every step you can. Make change real in small and in compelling steps. Use compelling and sensory language. Help them to experience the change physically. Let them hear it, see it, work with it, use it in early and in small ways. And last, remember that change is a beginning. It's not an end. And change is not something that you can put on autopilot. If you want to achieve long-term adoption, you have to keep measuring and marketing your successes after go live. So remember to shine a spotlight on successes. When you hear customers talk about things that went really well for them, encourage them to tell those stories. What did they do that they wish they had known sooner? What were those surprises? What were those gotchas and the pleasant surprises? Ultimately, change adoption comes down to customer happiness. And if your customers like the change, they'll stick with it. So measure customer happiness. You will be surprised how that works magic for you. So that's it for our Change Management Fundamentals class today. I hope you found this information meaningful and helpful for your own projects. I would love to hear from you. So if you would like to leave your email from my website, I'll reach out and provide regular updates on my future classes that I'll be posting online. Look for my next 2, which are going to be about leadership skills for change agents. Have fun with change. Change management takes a lot of skill development and leadership, but I know you can be great at this. And we're at a point in history where expert change leaders are needed now more than ever. These projects produce lasting memories and lots of fun relationships along the way. And I know that soon you'll be going from "that's impossible" to "what's next?"